of praise. What once was dead is now alive. You gave to me the breath of life. You brought me up out from the grave. I'm bursting out with songs of praise. I'm bursting out with songs of praise. I'm bursting out with songs of praise. You, my God, have saved my soul. I am yours forevermore. I won't be moved of this, I'm sure. You, my God, and you saved my soul. You, my God, have saved my soul. I am yours forevermore. I won't be moved of this, I'm sure. You, my God, and you saved my soul.
Right, good afternoon to you, and lovely to see you all as well, and those of you who are joining us online as well. I'm glad to welcome you also. I'd love to have you here, but I know that for 101 different reasons you're not able to be here, but those that are here, welcome to you. I hope you're enjoying your lunch today and enjoying the company as well. My guess is that probably most, if not all of you, have at least in one part of your mind through these days, you have what's going on in Ukraine, and just wondering how all of that is going to play out. And sometimes when you see some of the pictures, when you hear some of the stories, you must kind of tremble a little bit and think this is just not how it's meant to be. And it certainly got me thinking through the course of the past days, the extent to which this congregation has in some ways its present roots back in the First World War. It's been in existence obviously longer than since the 1914-18 war. But back in the 1914-18 war, there was a man called Walker Leith, who in the trenches of the First World War, and I cannot begin to imagine how horrific it must have been to be involved like that in the First World War. I once read a book by Sebastian Faulks that was a novel, but it was very graphically descriptive of the experience of soldiers in the First World War. And I remember thinking, having read that, anyone who'd been through that must have started asking questions, thought, could there possibly be a God? And yet out of the First World War, there came that phrase that has become familiar, there are no atheists in the trenches. There are no atheists in foxholes. And this man, Walker Leith, was one such individual. He was fighting in the First World War, I think probably terrified out of his wits, wondering if he would ever survive. And in the trenches, he prayed. He wasn't a particularly devout, religiously minded man at all, but in the trenches he prayed. And he begged that God would preserve him, and made a promise in the trenches that if God preserved him, he would fight for God's church for the rest of his life. And he was preserved, came out of the trenches. And subsequent to that, at a time when Gilcomston Church was at a really low ebb and was about to be closed down, that man, because of the promise that he had made at that time, he fought tooth and nail to keep this church open. And at that point where it really was about just to go down the tubes, because that one man, on the basis of the promise that he had made in the trenches as he cried out to God, he fought tooth and nail to ensure this church did not close. And 80, 90, 100 years down the line, here we are to this day, because that one man in the trenches prayed that prayer. In the trenches, in the pits, that's really where we're going to be at today. The start of the book of Samuel in the Bible is about a woman who effectively changed the world. Her name was Hannah, and if you simply looked at her story, you'd wonder, how did she change the world? Well, the reason why she changed the world, you have to look a good few decades down the line. And you've all heard of that king of Israel who went by the name of David. And King David really turned the whole fortunes of that people of Israel. He turned them right around. They were in fairly marked decline, and he turned the fortunes completely around and made that small country an astonishingly powerful, influential kingdom. And if you ask, well, how did David come to be such an individual with such a trust in the living God, such a fervent faith in the living God, then you go back a generation to this man Samuel and say, well, it was really through Samuel's long ministry where he taught a whole generation of youngsters. It was through his ministry that David rose up. And if you go back a generation before that and say, well, how come you have Samuel? It's because of this lady, Hannah, who was his mother, who nurtured him, raised him, bore him. And her story begins with her in the pits, metaphorical trenches. She was in a desperate place. And the backdrop to the story there is very simple. She was married to a man called Elkanah, who had 2 wives, and it sounds very much as though Hannah was actually his first wife, but because she didn't have any children, he went and married another wife as well. Not a clever idea, but he did that. The other wife was called Peninnah, and Peninnah had children. And because she had children in a day where children were really the mark of success, she mocked and she looked down upon Hannah and made life miserable for Hannah, who didn't have any children, couldn't have any children. And Hannah, eventually, in that state, she went to the temple, and we pick up the story in chapter 1 at verse 9. They'd gone, as they usually did, to the temple for their annual sacrifice. And at verse 9, once when they'd finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now, Eli the priest was sitting in his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. I want to pause there in the narrative. We're not going to look at more than just 3 verses today, but I want to pause there because some of you, either here or watching online, it may well be that in a metaphorical sense, that's exactly where you are. You are in the pits. That happens to us for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it can be illness. Sometimes it can be a tragedy that happens, a bereavement that happens. Sometimes it can be the bottom falls out of our world. Sometimes it can just be depression. A cloud just hangs over us and sucks us down and find ourselves in this dark, difficult place like that euphemistically is called simply the pits. My favorite psalm is Psalm 40 because it is a psalm that speaks about that. I would like that sung at my funeral because it tells you everything about me. You want to find out everything about me, go and read Psalm 40. He took me from a dreadful pit and from the miry clay and set my feet upon a rock, establishing my way. That's verse 2. And that's me. I was in the pits. And it is a dreadful place to be, no mistake about it. Miry clay, you try and clamber out, you try your best to get yourself out of that place, and you just can't get out of it. And in that place, the psalmist is saying, I cried to the Lord, which is what I did, and which is what Hannah did here as well. And I want you simply, as we run through these 3 verses very quickly, just to notice these 3 things. Number 1 is her posture. If you picked up on that, you can see the script there of that verse. You will see she was standing where the priest, Eli, was sitting. And her posture is indicative of of the first important lesson for you, if that's where you are. If you're in the pits, stand up. Don't simply resign yourself to it, but adopt a firm resolve. This is not how it's going to end. And that's what Hannah is doing. She is on her feet rather than simply kind of sitting back and saying, you know what, nothing is ever going to change. She is of a mind that there is a God who is able to change things, and she will stand up and say, I'm not just going to sit down and accept it. I'm going to stand, and there is that firm resolve. That's the first thing. As the story moves on, we come to something else, the next verse. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And so I want to say just a very brief thing about her passion. Sometimes we think passion is all, being really enthused and really fired up and really full of love and full of a delight and full of joy. But equally, passion is when we're really in the pits and we are weeping our eyes out. We are crying our heart out. We are hurting and we are screaming within and crying out like that. And that's what Hannah is doing. She's not pretending that things are all okay. So when she goes to the temple, if you were to go there and you were to ask her, how you doing, Hannah? She wouldn't be saying, yeah, I'm fine, and good face, a good front on it. She is in deep anguish and she is weeping bitterly, tears streaming down her face like that. It is patently clear this woman is hurting. And in the pits, it's important. And hopefully it's one of the things that we facilitate in the life of the family of God. You don't have to pretend to be something else than what you are. You don't have to be and pretend to be really pious. You don't have to pretend to be really okay and held together. Honesty, a simple, humble honesty is what Hannah is displaying. This is where I'm at. I'm just torn apart inside. And in the temple, in the house of God, in the place of worship, she's able simply to be what she is. And that's important as well. You just come before the Lord and you pour your heart out to him in that manner. And don't pretend somehow that things are okay, that you're not struggling, when in truth you are. And the final verse that I want us to read, just the next verse after that, verse 11, she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. And that prayer changed the course of history. Remarkable in some ways. That single verse where her prayer is recorded for us, that really changed the course of history, because she prayed that the Lord would give her a son, and in due course that son was born. That was Samuel. Samuel grew up, was given over to the Lord, as Hannah had said, and he became one who reshaped the whole of the land of Israel and was instrumental, really, in David, a generation later, rising up to exercise the sort of faith that he did, that trust in the living God that enabled him to provide such a strong, clear rule in the land of Israel that turned the whole country around and reshaped history in many ways. It all began there with Hannah in that prayer that she made. And what she's doing is she is boldly laying hold of God and saying, I am crying out to you and asking, Lord, help me. And you know what, Lord? You help me, and I will be absolutely given over to you. My dearest possession will be yours. Everything that I am will be yours. If you remember back to the way I started, Walker Leith in the trenches, that's what he was saying. You do that for me, Lord. I'm yours. I'm not the best raw material. I'm not that religious, maybe. I'm not that devout, and I've not got a life really that has a lot going for it. But I'm going to fight tooth and nail for your cause the rest of my life. And that's what Hannah is saying. You do that for me, Lord, please, and I'm yours. Every waking moment of my life will be yours. Every dearest possession that I have is yours. Grant me that. And in the pits, that's how you pray. You cry out to the Lord and do so, affirming with that bold commitment. You do that, Lord. You lift me out of the pits, and I'm yours. And that's my story. That's why I'm here today, because in the pits, I cried out to the Lord, and he lifted me out of that dreadful pit, out of that miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock. Jesus himself gave me a new start, put a new song in my mouth, enabled me to live out a whole new life. And in the pits there, you do that, Lord, I'm yours. Absolutely, through and through, yours. And may that be your experience as well. In the pits, maybe where you're at today, don't pretend that you're not, but have that firm resolve that you will indeed press on and just not accept that this is where the story is going to end, but press on and say, Lord, do something, please. I can't help myself. You're going to have to lift me out. I'm looking to you. Let me pray. Lord, thank you for this extraordinary narrative in the Bible. Just 3 verses that are explosive in the immediacy of the context today. There will be some, Lord, who are really in the pits at the moment. And maybe you've just been hiding that behind a facade of everything being, broadly speaking, okay, but inside just churned around. And if that's the case, then would you simply speak this word into their hearts and lives and say that as it was for Hannah, so it will be for you? Would you do that for them, Lord? And would you enable us so to recognize what you have done for us in Jesus by lifting us out in him and putting our feet upon solid ground, enabling us to press on forward? Would you enable us to live out our day-by-day lives with gratitude and with that eagerness to serve you and your Son in all regards? So hear us, living God, and meet us in our need as we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, as I say, lovely to have you with us today. We'll kind of play out in a moment or two with a song that'll come up called My Chains Break Every Chain. Jesus breaks the chains that drags us down, lifts us up, gives a new start. God bless you.